Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever it is where you're at. This week what I want to do is I want to focus on Microsoft 365 DSC Blueprints. We've had an episode in the past where I was showing you how to do an assessment of any existing tenant against what we call a blueprint. Now this command was called assert-M365DSC template. And we've had a lot of people reporting issues with that commandlet, and the reason for this is that it's actually using the DSC engine under the cover to go and do that assessment, and that requires an account that's not MFA enabled, and there were some issues as well with some resources for security and compliance and so on. So that method has been deprecated now. What we're doing to replace it is something that's much better, is a new command called assert M365DSC Blueprint, right? Kind of obvious. But this command now accepts you passing in a URL that points to a blueprint, right? So that blueprint can be hosted anywhere, or it can be a path to a local file. So you can have the blueprint hosted locally on your computer and assess any tenant against that blueprint. Now, in my case here, my demo blueprint that I'm going to be using for this demo is hosted on GitHub, which is probably the best place to host it because I can have people contribute to it. I can have people make modifications, submit PRs. I have a history of what changed in that blueprint. So definitely makes a lot of sense to host it in a GitHub project. Now, before we move on, let me take a few steps back and just talk about what a blueprint is. A Microsoft 365 DSC Blueprint is nothing but a Microsoft 365 DSC configuration. But it's a special type of configuration that has been reviewed and approved by your organization. Think of it as the golden configuration, right? What you really want your tenant to be configured as. Or even think of it as a baseline, right? Saying that if you want to get started with M365 tenants in our organization, you need to have at least that baseline applied, be it security and compliance baseline, be it Teams configuration baseline, you name it. Now, the idea is that I'm going to be able to take that blueprint and assess my current tenant, any existing tenant, against what's defined in it. And if there are any configuration drift, it's going to tell me, look, the blueprint recommends you have this setting set to true, for example, but in your tenant it's set to false. But not only this, but it's also going to tell you why we recommend you setting it to false instead of true. And the way we let you do this is by adding support for metadata inside of Microsoft 365 Blueprints. M365 DSC Blueprint, sorry. Now, you can see from my GitHub repo here that my blueprint has an extension of M365 DSC. Again, don't let this fool you. It's nothing but a PS1 file that I've renamed M365 just to make sure that it's clear that this is an approved template if you want. So in my demo template, what I'm defining two components. I'm defining a Teams meeting policy. So I'm basically saying that the global Teams meeting policy needs to prevent people from doing cloud recording, needs to allow people, external participant, to give request control and so on, right? So this is just an example, and really the comments that are going to follow, I'm going to cover this in just a while, but those comments are just there for demo purposes, right? Don't think that this is what we recommend. It's just a demo. Now, in my template, so in my blueprint, I'm defining messaging policy and Teams meeting policy. So only two components. And what you can see here is that on top of it, I have a new section here. After the property value, so this is basically saying that this needs to be false. And in here, what I'm defining is metadata. And the way I'm telling the engine that I'm going to be providing metadata for that property is by using the 3 pound signs, which basically says what follows is a metadata comment. And the first property is going to be the level of severity for this drift, right? So in my case here, I'm providing L1. So there are 3 levels really. L1 is critical. That means if there's a drift there, you really need to take a look at it and do something about it. L2 is there's a warning. Look, we don't recommend you setting that value. Here's why, but it's really up to you to do it. And then L3 is verbose. So it's basically just, look, you have a drift, right? That could be a list of users or a list of accounts that we recommend you using and you're not following it. Well, it really doesn't matter that much. Now, in my case here, what I have is a level 1 critical drift detection. So if somebody was to assess this template against a tenant that has the allow anonymous users to start meeting property set to true, well, we want to flag that as an issue, right? We want to say, look, we don't recommend external participant with a good old typo right here, but we don't recommend external participant to be able to start meeting because malicious, blah, 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 blah. Right? So you actually provide context. Not only do you provide what the recommended value is, but you tell the user why you recommend that value. And on top of this, the outcome, right? So the output of this commandlet is going to be an HTML report. So you can have HTML markup inside of your comments to make it more useful to the user. So in my case here, I'm defining strong tags around the true value. So if there's a drift detected on this property, the message is going to have true show up as bold. Right? Nothing fancy, but it gives you flexibility. If you want to add images in there, diagrams, and so on, it's up to you, really. Now, what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to be calling into this new command, so the assert M365DSC Blueprint, and there are two properties that I can pass in. I can pass in the URL or location, really, because as I mentioned, it could be a local path on your computer. The name of the property still remains Blueprint URL, even if it's a local path, but we handle both. In my case, I'm going to pass the URL to my file on GitHub. And then the other property is where do I want to store the report once the discrepancy report has been generated. So you need to pass in a full path to an HTML file on your computer. So make sure that the folder you specify here exists, and then just name your report whatever you want. So when I run this, first thing it's going to do is ask me for my credentials on the tenant I'm about to assess against that blueprint. Now, in my case, the template, so the blueprint, contained two components that were Teams components. Right? They were Teams policies. So I know under the cover that Teams policies use the Skype for Business Online module. So the user I'm using here needs to have at least Skype for Business Online administrator role. If my template also had SharePoint components, then it would have to have both SharePoint Online administrator and Teams or Skype for Business Online administrator roles. Right? In my case, I'm lazy. I'm going to use the good old global admin, but just know that you don't need to use that. Actually, all you need is an account that has read access on the workload. You don't even need something that will be able to write back, because all we're going to be doing is extract components from your tenant to assess it against the blueprint. So in my case here, I'm going to go in, so admin, non-MFA at, just bear with me for a sec. All right, so my credentials are provided. First thing it's going to do is it's going to go and locally download that M365 blueprint from GitHub. So you're going to see a flash. So it downloaded the blueprint. And now it's doing an assessment. So it's basically parsing that template, and it's realizing that in that blueprint, I only have two DSC components. I have Teams meeting and Teams messaging policy. So it knows that the only thing it needs to export from my tenant are these two components. So it's not going to go crazy and start extracting all components from my tenant to do the assessment. It's only going to go and grab those two. So if I go back here, you see that it's currently doing an export. So under the cover, for those that are interested as to what's happening, it's calling into the export M365DSC configuration commandlet, and it's passing in components to extract. And in this case here, it's only listing two, sorry about this. So it's listing two properties. So it's listing two components, sorry. So Teams meeting policy and messaging policy. Those are the only two that are going to be extracted, because it realized that in my blueprint, right? So it says it right here, selected blueprint contains two components to assess, initializing or initiating the export on those two components from the tenant. So what it did is it did an export for all Teams meeting policies and all Teams messaging policies from my tenant based on the credentials I passed. And it's going to take that export and assess it against my blueprint. And what it's going to give me is a nice report that looks just like a Christmas tree. I apologize in advance, right? But my motto is always make it useful, not pretty. So in this case here, what it's giving me is a report, a delta report, a discrepancy report that gives me exactly what the differences are between my tenant and the actual tenant I went and assessed the blueprint against. In my case here, it's telling me that, you know what, your allow external participant give request control is recommended to be set to false, but your tenant has it set to true. And then we have our recommendation on top of it where it says we don't recommend you allowing external participant to give request control because that exposes your organization to threats. Right? So whatever you come up with, and you can see here my true value that I had wrapped in strong HTML tags is showing up as bold as well. So you can go in and you can do whatever you want. You can come up with any metadata you want on your blueprints. We are currently working on I don't want to say official community led blueprint repository on GitHub, where people are going to be able to contribute to a bunch of blueprints we're working on. If you're interested in creating your own blueprint, please reach out. Let me know where they're at, just so that I can have a look. I can actually contribute, give you some feedback on some of the blueprints you have. And yeah, hopefully that will open the door to a whole lot of new contribution from the community. If you have any questions, always, you can find me on Twitter at Nick Charlebois. And I wish you a good day, and we'll talk again soon.